Welcome to the EntrePastors podcast on YouTube. This is a show that helps pastors think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the EntrePastors podcast on YouTube. My name is John Sanders. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show, and so excited to introduce you to the conversation that we're going to have today with our guest, Teresa McCloy. We talk about a lot of things in this upcoming episode, but one thing that really stood out to me was Teresa talks about that decision point if you as a pastor decide to become an entrepreneur and you basically take that EntrePastor journey. Just know that there's going to be a sense of loneliness that comes with that, meaning so many people around you simply will not get it. They don't understand what it is to be a pastor in the first place, and they certainly don't understand what it is to be a pastor and an entrepreneur at the same time. And she explains in there and unpacks this idea of a solution to that is to get around people who do get it. And that's exactly what we're trying to do through our EntrePastors community here, through our podcast, our membership community, our mastermind, our free Facebook group, which we would invite you to be a part of. We are trying to bring together a group, a community of pastors who do get it so that you don't feel that loneliness on the EntrePastor journey. But I guarantee there's some really good stuff in this show upcoming for you. So without any further ado, let me cut to this interview that Les and I did recently with Teresa McCloy. Check this out. Well, Teresa, welcome to the EntrePastors podcast. We're so glad to have you on the show, my friend.
Oh, it is so great to be here. It's going to be fun.
Yes, we're going to have fun here together. So you are exactly in the kind of the profile of the community that we serve because you understand entrepreneurial business stuff and you understand ministry. You come from that world as well. Pastoral ministry, to be specific. So why don't we start with just a general introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into ministry and where you are in the world. And then we'll start exploring the business side of things.
Absolutely. So my background started entrepreneurial. I ran several different businesses before I went into ministry. And then started, that volunteer position that many pastors end up like, oh, I'm just involved and I'm, doing all those things. Ended up into a part-time position in creative arts and then into a full-time position and worked at a couple of different churches in that capacity, worship ministry, leading the teams, doing all the, this sounds maybe a little bit crass, but I often said I used my entrepreneurial skills in the ministry kind of in a marketing sense. I did all of our publications. I did all of our screens, did all the worship and production of what it takes many times as a church to do the 7-day turnaround that many of your listeners live in, that every 7 days I need to turn it around. And I did that during a time where that production piece was being compared to television or to, that high level quality that we have to come at. And that was really hard. And it led to a lot of my story. I spent almost 10 years there in that, just grinding it out every 7 days and turning it around. And I know a lot of your listeners come from that. And it took its toll on me, especially in a life story that we were living out at that time. And so step back out of that in 2015 and, some things that were going on in our family. I just felt a need to come back home and be a part of our family business where we live on a small farm in Southern Illinois near St. Louis, Missouri. And so knew that I needed to come back home and then ended up creating the business that I have now, which so much ties to my story of that workaholic nature that I had developed early on in my life, but really carried heavily as a pastor. Really carried the burden heavily. And so that's a lot of what I speak to is just busy entrepreneurs, busy pastors, people that are, I say, living with their hair on fire. And how could I do this differently? And so kind of created a process around that. And God's been really faithful and good to kind of pull that together and put that together. And we just love serving the people that we do.
That's awesome. So that's a good overview. I want to just back up and go a little deeper into a few of those things. So what I'm
Sure.
hearing you say is you took a path in terms of church ministry where you made the mistake of volunteering and becoming a great volunteer that then turns into, hey, we actually have a position for you. And now
Yes,
you're in
that
a
was the
staff
path.
role, right? So you're
Yeah.
serving as a staff. And I heard you say it was in the realm of like production. So I'm hearing, so fill in the gaps if I'm missing this, but I'm hearing that you were working in a church setting where they are putting out, kind of a high level production. Maybe it's an online streaming thing, but certainly in-house there's a level of video and
Yeah.
graphics and all
Yeah.
of that.
I
Like that
was
was your thing?
yes, we called it creative arts pastor. And so I led worship every Sunday. I did every worship service. I did all the screens, all the technology piece. I have a huge love of technology, and I brought that into the role. We, at that point, weren't doing online streaming very often, once in a while, but all of our communication, I was over anything that we produced and put out there. We weren't a hugely, 300, 350 size in church, the last place I worked, but yet, as many of your listeners know, there's something all the time. So we ran a huge program in the church called Upward Basketball. Some of your listeners might be familiar, where we had 1,000 to 1,200 people in and out of our building on a Saturday. Over 550 kids in that program. So all of that, it wasn't just the 5 days a week, right? It's the Saturday all day from 8 in the morning to 8 at night. And we created that for ourselves. And I'm not proud of how much we were trying to do at that time. It was too much for who we were and what we had going. And it took its toll on all of us as a staff. Like, I look back now and you're in the moment, you don't realize where you're at. You kind of have to climb up on the balcony sometimes. That's a lot of what I do now is how do you get up there and look down and go, wow, I need to say no to that and yes to this and all that kind of thing. So that's where I was. And that's where I ended up because all of that production and communication revolved out of the role that I played.
Yeah. Well, you're hitting so many pastors in our audience right where they live. Our message is for pastors that we want you to thrive financially, and we understand often that's not going to come through simply being solely employed through the church. We would love for you to develop some kind of business of your own out in the marketplace. We see great value in that. And so one of the common things we hear from pastors is, man, I'm already, as you said, my hair is already on fire here in ministry, just trying to keep up with church life. And now you're wanting me to add another component to my life. So let's go a little deeper into that. And maybe you can walk us through the transition, where you got to that place of, I don't know if you would use the word burnout in ministry or how you would describe your story, but how did you go from that into, I'm stepping back from this ministry role, this pastoral ministry role, and I'm going to, go into more of a business of my own. Walk us through that story.
Well, because I had that entrepreneurial background, and I think there are a lot of pastors out there that maybe this hasn't been the only thing they've ever done. Right. And so I had that. I had owned a retail clothing store. I had ran a piano studio out of my home. Almost everything I had done when my children were little was so that I could work and still be a mom and be at home and figure that out. I taught it at parochial school, taught music and different things because that's my background. And so I knew that entrepreneurial space, and I knew my personality was once I decided I needed to make the shift, and mine was a definite shift, but there were some things I purposely did before I did the shift. As God often does, in getting my attention, we were also walking a really difficult story with our son who was struggling with drug addiction. And so those parallel stories of my own addictive behavior to work and my son's addictive behavior became hugely parallel stories. And I knew that I had to let something go to be present to my family and to their needs. And unfortunately, I knew it needed to be the ministry I was serving in. I didn't know if God would call me back in, but I knew at that point I needed to let it go. So I started preparing myself. I didn't just say, hey, I quit. I actually knew I had skills. So I think that's important is for a pastor to look at what are the skills I know? What do I know what to do? What comes natural to me? I'm probably a natural leader. So for me, technology was a huge thing that was a natural thing for me. And I knew how to communicate well. I knew how to do all those things. So I actually made the choice to become a virtual assistant. And I knew that I could use those skills. And I applied to a service that at that time it was called Belay, I think. It's one that's highly talked about, and it's a great service. So I said, I'm going to take my skills. And so in the last 6 months that I was in ministry, I started applying, developing. It's hard to get hired by them. They do a lot of screening. And I was going through that process of, what do I know how to do well? How can I take what I know and create a different business? So I knew as I transitioned out that I had something I was transitioning into and was already hired on a part-time basis. That eventually led, and I think what I'd love for your listeners to hear is, you may not, whatever the side gig is that you're going to develop may not be where God has you end up, but just do the next thing, do something. There's a million little side gigs you might start, because what happened out of that VA gig, I had one of my clients on a call say to me, you're not a virtual assistant, you're really a coach. I'm like, And crazily enough, I had hired a coach for my son back when he was in high school with his ADHD. So I knew kind of what a coach, I had this weird little thing. So I pulled that from my past and said, what would it look like? And I started Googling and started looking. So that led me to this. I mean, God always has a plan. God always has a little nugget that he's going to give you, right? And I'm like, that'll open a door. That was in 2015, 6 years later, here we are. So I would say, look at your skill, look at what you know how to do, look at what gifts you have, and what's the amount of time you have to give, commit to 5 hours a week, or as our friend Dan Miller says, right, 10 hours a week or whatever, and find where it fits and start developing it. If not, you're on the merry-go-round. You're just spinning. So,
yeah. Well, why don't we fast forward and talk about the here we are now? Describe for our audience, what is the work that you're doing now? Because you're not a VA anymore, and you're more than a coach, I would contend. So tell us about the work that you do now.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I have, over the last 6 years, developed out a process. And again, through God just saying, no, it's not exactly that. I started looking at coaching programs and getting into different things and getting training. I actually trained at one point with a company called 12 Week Year, which is a very popular book. When I worked in ministry, again, pulling forward a skill. When I worked in ministry, I was the one who did our church calendar, who did all of our planning. And I had developed it in, as you both know, as pastors, there's seasons to ministry, right? There's the Christmas season, there's the Easter season, there's the summer season. So I had naturally developed our church calendar stuff around seasons. So 90-day processes were very familiar to me. And so when I trained with 12 Week Year, I'm like, this makes sense. I also have a huge background in spiritual formation and in spiritual disciplines and practices. And that was something I sought out in my last few years in ministry, because I was burnout and I was doing a lot of teaching about Jesus, but I had lost my personal relationship. And I think some of your listeners might relate to that as well. Yeah. And so I was working on that. And so God brought kind of all of that together. And I had a coach that I had hired say to me one time, why are you doing someone else's stuff? Like it's time for you to take everything you have and put it into your own process. So that's what happened in 2016, early 2017. I just started developing my own process and my own intellectual property and how I would coach someone. The phrase we now use with the new book we have coming out is do what matters, live from rest, not rush. Mm-hmm. So live from an internal place, not an external place, which is where I lived from. How much can I get done? How productive can I be? How many hours can I put in? I'm not proud of this story, but again, I bet one of your listeners will relate. There were times I spent the night at the church.
Wow.
The whole entire night, because we had a big Easter service or something coming up, and it had to be perfect. Les, you ever been there?
Man,
John's raising his hand on
as they say down here. You're on the farm, so you know what it means to say you're plowing real close to the corn right now.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, man, because so many of our folks, I'm like John, I can just imagine the man or the woman hearing these things, and it's like you're reading their mail, because these are the topics that they talk about and really need to push through. And we've been there as well. So, you're talking about 6 or 7 years in this world that we're talking about, in terms of the using relationships and social media and the tools that we have. It's like 6 years is like 20 to 25 in our previous life.
It is.
So much can happen in even just 2 or 3 years in this world. So take us back to some mindset shifts that took place in your life, because I'm sure that they did, especially as you were transitioning out and you finally pulled the trigger. It's one thing to be able to do some, have kind of the best of both worlds, or the challenges of both worlds. But when you really made that shift and said, okay, it's time. So here's my question, if I could. Part one, did you find a lot of acceptance and encouragement and cheerleading among your colleagues or even family members who ask you questions about calling and role and, commitment to serving the Lord in the local church capacity? And then how you finally made that shift and said, that stage of life now in this way is ended, and God's going to use me to minister in a different way. What was that like?
Yeah. Well, I remember, and I imagine both of you have been there, and I just want to say up front, you're going to feel very lonely when you make that shift. So it's hugely important, because people didn't understand. You're resigning from something you seem to love to do, and you're really good at it, and we love you. And as most pastors know, your church becomes your community, right? Oh, they are your people. Sadly, sometimes when you step away from that, and I'm just being blunt, honest, you lose all those relationships, because you were their pastor and now you're not.
Yep.
And that was the relationship that was really hard for me, because I thought we had lots deeper friendships than we had. Yeah. And I don't mean that they were false. I'm not blaming the congregation that I stepped away from for that. It's just the role that they saw me in, right?
Right.
I was the person they called at 2 a.m. to come to the hospital. I was the person, and now I'm not there for them anymore. And so
even they have coffee.
Yeah. There is a little bit of identity crisis, right? Sure. Like that I had to walk through. Mm-hmm. The one thing I love to do, and it's just part of my personality, it might not be for every listener, is I love community and connection, and I value it highly. And I had to learn to value it even as I walked through crisis and trauma in my own life and in our own home as a pastor. I remember, and, I'll share this brief story, standing on the platform, leading worship, last song of, the worship set. My husband standing at the back of the room with a cell phone in his hand. And I knew that our son had overdosed again. Mm. And I'm leading worship. Man. And I know you have listeners who I've been in those crisis moments where who's pastoring me, right? Yeah. Who's coming to me? And I was the one who put on the tough face and was like, I never asked for time off. I never said, hey, I've got a family crisis. Would my elders come around me and minister to me? And they didn't do it wrong. I just didn't ask.
Right.
And so that added to the burnout. So when I resigned, I did felt like I lost a community and felt very alone. And that sounds really discouraging to your people. So I don't want it to feel that way, because the action you have to take is plug into a new community. And I found that in the mastermind that the three of us are in. And I remember having the conversation with Dan, and it doesn't have to be a mastermind. It could be a free thing. It could be your group. That's exactly what you guys are offering to pastors. So this is the perfect community for these people to be in if you're in this place. But I had to reach out, and I remember saying to Dan, I got to replace my church. Like, I need some people. Yeah. And I did that actually in 2 or 3 places. One of them was paid. Most of them were free, that I just had to get online, because I live in Nowhereville, Southern Illinois. And I had to get online. And it wasn't even as prevalent as it is now, right? COVID has even changed the growth of the online space. And I had to find, I was in a Wednesday night group through Dan's free community or his paid community. We met every Wednesday night. There was about 20 of us that just got on together. And some of us are still friends to this day. That's to encourage one another totally on our own time, because we needed each other. So I would encourage in that stage where you're getting ready to make the shift, prepare to find community somewhere. And this, what you guys are offering is the perfect spot.
Well, we appreciate that. And we feel the same way. So when it came that time, was there, and you feel free to share whatever you want to share, but was there something that happened that was a catalyst to trigger that? Or did you have a kind of a plan and a timeline, or were there some thresholds that you were wanting to get to? And you said, when that happens, I can do this and make that shift.
Unfortunately for us, the timeline was really pushed by our son's addiction and by a crisis that was happening in our home. But I didn't even realize it. I realize it more now than I did at the time. Right. My own coping behaviors were just to work more because this sounds probably not super kind, but I'm doing God's work. So that's probably getting me more stars in my crown. Right. But that was such a false behavior. Yeah. But many times I think for pastors, when your own family or your own situations are in crisis, or you're feeling like, man, I'm just not giving enough time to my own kids that I'm raising in my own home, but yet I'm giving everything to someone else's family. That was the catalyst for me that created a timeline where I started looking 6 months out and saying, by this time, and again, because we're farmers, I knew I wanted to be resigned by the time spring planting came, to be able to be in a tractor. Yes, I love to drive a tractor, and help my husband, because my husband was also in crisis because he was losing his son who farmed with us. And we had to ask him to leave the farm and all of those things that come with that. Yes. And so I knew if I needed to love my husband well, that I needed to set the congregation and the church pastoral role aside. Didn't know if God would call me back or not. Right. And he has called me back. And I want your listeners to hear this. I do as much ministry now,
no doubt,
as I ever did inside the church. And I am in an active, thriving church, and I love what I do in my church, but I love what I do in the entrepreneurial space and how I get to talk and minister and be with people in crisis and be with people to grow their businesses and to help them. We train and grow other coaches now and facilitators, and that's what we've developed is a process for them to have done for you content and certification to build their own businesses. So I've gone from, that doing my own to now helping others do theirs. Yeah.
Great segue. So, and here's what in a minute, we're going to talk about the book. I'd like for you to talk about your platform now and how people can engage with you if they feel led to do that, because I can't think of a better person to come alongside of someone that's going through that transition than you, Teresa. I've seen you with people. I've heard your story. I've seen you interact with the people in our tribe. And I would just, for anyone that resonates with your story, I would encourage them to reach out. So here's my question about we've talked about a little bit of the cloudy and the dark times. So now there was a day that the clouds started to part and the sun began to shine.
Yes.
And then you had a sense in your spirit, man, that I'm on the right track.
Yeah.
I'm where I need to be. What was that like?
Well, I want to use kind of a little bit of scenario because I think your listeners will relate to this. You have to go to that place of, I'm going to start this, right? There's phases in growing an entrepreneurial business and stepping out. So startup, for me, that was taking the risk of, I'm going to go be a VA. I'm just going to go do something. And I could have actually done both at the same time. I could have done a little bit of overlap there. I chose not to. So that's that startup phase. Then there's a phase in your growth of an entrepreneurial business that's a validate stage. I'm validating that this works. I'm validating that other people will show up, that they'll purchase my little or big thing, that whatever I'm doing, that I can create some income and revenue off of this. So I'm validating it. And once you've validated it for a little while, that could be 6 months to a year, whatever that might be, then you're in this stage of scaling it. Like now I'm going to take it to the next level, right? I'm going to scale it. I'm going to multiply this out. I'm going to offer another thing. I think you guys are getting ready to do a retreat or something. That's another part of your scaling. And then you move to multiply. And I had to go through every one of those stages. The multiply stage, the parting of the waters, as you were saying there, the clouds opening up, actually came again when I was forced in COVID. When the world kind of shut down, I had lots of speaking engagements and workshops and different live events, because that's what I love to do, that I was going to host. We'd already been hosting some weekend retreats, taking people through our 4-step, or at that point we called it 4 steps, 4 components of our process. And in a really intense retreat weekend, all that was shut down. So I'm like, okay, God, now what? And I had always had it in the back of my head a little bit to maybe at some point, okay, I've got this content, it's working, it's scalable, that I might put it out there for others to use. So in 2020, of April of 2020, we launched our facilitator certification program and said, okay, if this works for us and we have the content and we've created this process, this is repeatable. Others could use this also, people that don't want to go create their own thing or need that support. So that's what we developed in 2020. That was our multiply, parting of the waters. Oh my goodness. Now we have 35 or 36 facilitators in 18 months around the country and in the Bahamas. That's the one I want to go visit. that are doing this same work, and we're supporting them as a community and with content and with coaching and teaching them how to show up, lead retreats, workshops, coach one-to-one, all those types of things. So yeah, there is that, but you have to go through all those stages. You have to start, you have to validate it, then scale it a little bit. And then God's going to multiply it. I mean, I just think it's so, God's going to multiply it into ministry that you get to do. It just looks a little bit different than what you're doing right now.
That's so good.
It's awesome. So you've got a brand new book that is on its way out, or it's already out, or it's getting ready to come out.
It will actually, I'll probably have books in hand this summer, and it will be out this fall. So,
okay.
So we're in those stages of book development. But I just shared with you guys right before we went live that, the cover's designed, and, we're in all those fun stages of, wow, this is really going to happen. So
happening. Yeah, that's great. So if someone wanted to connect with you, Teresa, what's the best way for them to find you and learn more about the work that you're doing in the world?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The best way to find us is actually go to our website, which is thereallifeprocess.com. And we spell real life with one L. So REALIFE, the real life, all one word, thereallifeprocess.com. And you can find out about all the different things, what we have, the certification program, just how you connect with us. We have a podcast as well. Just all the different things that we do.
Well, I'm getting ready to take you backstage. And before we go there, I'm going to have you talk just a little bit about what we're going to talk about backstage so that people kind of know where we're going. But before we do, Teresa, I got to back way up in the conversation and tell you, for a minute there, I'm fighting back tears as I'm hearing you share the stories specifically about that feeling alone. Like when you make that decision to, quote, leave ministry and step into what I called a new season of ministry. Not everybody sees it that way. It's very likely that people that are close to you, people that you've loved and led and served for so long, they just see it as you're quitting. Yes. And then those losing that sense of community and some of those relationships and coming to that realization that, was I just your pastor then? Is that all this was? We weren't actually as close as I felt like we were. That's a real thing. And yet then you really tied it up with a bow about you are doing just as much, if not more ministry in the marketplace and the role that you're doing now. I just want pastors to hear that, and just thank you for that. That
Absolutely.
ministers to me.
Yes.
I'm going to share this with my wife as soon as we're done on this interview. I'm going to be like, you got to listen to this, because we've walked through that. That's been our EntrePastor journey these last few years of wrestling through that whole weird thing. And it's like, in our heart of hearts, we know we haven't quit ministry, but I know there's people who don't understand the journey we're on, who don't approve of it, who aren't real happy. They would love nothing more than to see us still in that role. That we just came to realize God has us in a new role, a new season, and it's good and it's healthy, and we're grateful for it.
Amen.
But it was a tough transition. So I'm glad that just ministered to me hearing you say it.
I'm glad it did. And I want to say, and I don't mean this to sound harsh towards that congregation you've served or that community, because this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but when they're responding to you in that way, that's about them, not about you.
For sure.
And that's their hurt coming through. You didn't do anything to hurt them.
Right.
But that's their hurt coming through of the loss they're feeling. And unfortunately, we're such heart people. Usually when we're in ministry, we love our people. We love what we're doing, and they're just not seeing the bigger picture that God is calling us to right now. And so, yeah, I say that for you and for the listeners of, on the other side of it, there is light, but there is a season there where that's why it's so important to get with community quickly.
Yeah.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Outside of, and you're probably going to have to find that even outside your local community.
Right. Because just normal people just don't get it. They just don't understand ministry life to begin with. And then you add to it, hey, now I'm going to, move into this entrepreneurial thing. And there's just not a lot of folks that clicks with, and they go, oh, I get it. I see that. That makes sense. And go for it. That's not generally the message a pastor received. And you're right. It's exactly the community and support that we are providing and developing here at EntrePastor.
And I would say one more part of that, because I think your listeners, and then we'll wrap up. We could talk a long time, couldn't we?
I love this. Yeah.
Is it's going to be a difficult journey for you with your spouse as well, because for my husband and I, he served as an elder at the same church I was on staff at. Right. So usually your spouse is, whether it's man or woman and man, hugely involved in the same church you are. So when you make a decision to step out of that, you have to take in consideration. I mean, there was a period of time where I started attending another church. We tried to stay there because there wasn't anything wrong. We were just stepping out of ministry, and I couldn't. I found out really quickly I could not. I stayed for 3 or 4 months, but people still came to me like I was the pastor and, all that stuff. So I started attending another church. Dale stayed to finish out his term as an elder, my husband. And yet it was a big loss for us as a family, because that's what we lived and eat and sleep and breathe.
Yeah.
And so we even had to work within our marriage to go, now what do we talk about?
Right.
Now what do we do? Now, because it was everything. Yeah. And not that that was wrong. That's what God had called us to in that season. So I just say that to caution, find community, because there's a lot of shifts and changes, but it's worth it. It is worth it to begin that and to go do ministry where God is calling you in a different way.
Wow, that is so good. So real quick, as we wrap up this portion of the interview, in the backstage portion, we're going to talk about some time management things that specifically flow out of your real life process. And, I love that word picture you gave us early in the interview of someone running around with their hair on fire. That is where most pastors live, yes, day in and day out. And you've got some things to share to help us not live that way. So maybe just give a summary of what we're going to be talking about, then we'll wrap it up and head backstage.
Sure. So in our third component, we, in our process, we talk about what we call real life time. And we have 4 ways of looking at our calendar and blocking in these 4 really important areas, these 4 blocks. And so we're going to talk about that backstage of what those look like, how you identify them, and why each and every one of them is important. So you can begin to not feel like your hair is on fire, and that everything does belong and it does fit. Hugely important when a pastor is trying to transition from one to the other and find that time, right? Where would I even do this? So I think it's going to be a fun conversation.
Fantastic. Well, I saw, well, you were even saying that some of our backstage listeners got up and headed out. They're already waiting backstage for you. So we're going to go join them back there.
Okay, perfect.
Great summary. So Teresa, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you. And we love the work that you're doing and love hanging out with you in our community, that you're a part of our tribe.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Teresa.
It's been a blast.
Well, hey, thanks for watching this episode of the EntrePastors podcast. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can be notified every time we release a new episode. If you'd like to get connected to other pastors who are learning to think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs, then we invite you to check us out on Facebook. Just search for the EntrePastors Connect group, answer a few of our simple questions there, and we'd love to include you in the conversations. And if you're really ready to go to the next level, then we invite you to join our EntrePastors membership community. When you become a monthly subscriber, you will receive access to courses, exclusive community, and coaching that will help you along in your own EntrePastors journey. If there's anything else we can do to serve you, please visit us at EntrePastors.com, and we will do our best to serve you there. God bless everybody. See you soon.